Welcome to HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Overviews. This video will discuss small area fair market rents. While this video will be useful on its own, we encourage you to also watch the payment standard overview. Beginning in 2018, HUD began publishing small area fair market rents. Small area fair market rents, or SAFMRs, are rents calculated at the zip code level in a metropolitan area, as opposed to fair market rents, or FMRs, that are calculated across an entire metro area. Not all areas of the country have a published small area FMR, but for those areas that do, the small area FMR can be useful in setting payment standards closer to the rental market in the PHA's jurisdiction. All PHAs must determine what their payment standards are based on HUD's published fair market rents and, when applicable, small area fair market rents. As a reminder, a payment standard is the monthly maximum rental assistance payment that a PHA will make. Rents within a metro area may vary significantly from neighborhood to neighborhood. By using this more granular calculation, PHAs can increase the number of neighborhoods with units that are affordable and accessible to voucher holders, while potentially lowering payment standards in areas that have lower rents. Small area FMRs allow a PHA to select payment standards that may expand family access to higher opportunity neighborhoods, which in turn for voucher families can increase access to jobs, quality education, public transit, and other services. As you can see on the map, the small area FMRs for a two-bedroom unit in a region can vary significantly across zip codes. Small area FMRs will allow the PHA in this region to select payment standards that increase the number of units that are accessible to voucher holders in these higher-cost neighborhoods. There are three types of small area FMR adopter categories. 1. Designated small area FMR PHAs. 2. Opt-in small area FMR PHAs. And 3. PHAs that adopt small area FMRs as an exception payment standard. PHAs in areas designated for mandatory adoption of small area FMRs are referred to as designated small area FMR PHAs. These PHAs are required to use small area FMRs where applicable. PHAs that voluntarily choose to fully adopt small area FMRs are referred to as opt-in small area FMR PHAs. Lastly, PHAs may use small area FMRs as an exception payment standard for a specific zip code or group of zip codes. The use of small area FMRs is optional for most PHAs, but PHAs located in one of HUD's designated 24 metropolitan areas are required to adopt small area FMRs. These 24 metro areas include more than 200 PHAs. HUD designated these metro areas based on the following criteria at the time of designation. There are at least 2,500 housing choice vouchers under lease. At least 20% of the area's rental units were in zip codes with small area FMRs above 110% of the metro FMR. Voucher families living in concentrated low-income areas make up at least 25% of all renters in that area, and the rental vacancy rate for the metropolitan area is higher than 4%. The initial list of designated small area FMRs was published in 2018. HUD will review and update this list every 5 years. PHAs that administer vouchers in a metropolitan area where the adoption of small area FMRs is not required may request approval from HUD to voluntarily adopt small area FMRs. PHAs that choose to adopt small area FMRs must submit a written request to its local HUD Office of Public Housing. Opt-in small area FMR PHAs that are approved by HUD must amend their administrative plan, stating that it will operate according to small area FMRs and identify any policies adopted to implement small area FMRs. Small area FMRs will apply to all tenant-based vouchers in the applicable areas, including special purpose vouchers. For example, VASH, Family Unification Program, and special housing types like single room occupancy and home ownership vouchers. A payment standard is the maximum monthly assistance payment for a family assisted in the voucher program, before deducting the total tenant payment by the family. Payment standards are based on FMRs set by HUD, but are determined locally by PHAs. Similar to FMRs, unless a PHA has notified HUD of an exception, payment standards must be within the basic range of 90% to 110% of the small area FMR for each FMR area within its jurisdiction. This 90 to 110% range allows PHAs to account for local market conditions when adjusting payment standards. For example, in areas where fair market rents are changing rapidly and small area FMRs are not in line with current trends, the 90% to 110% range gives PHAs the ability to address data lag. This flexibility may be beneficial in areas experiencing upward market pressure, as well as in areas where rents are declining due to deteriorating neighborhood conditions. Please note there is a separate session that focuses on payment standards in more detail. An exception payment standard is a payment standard amount on the PHA payment standard schedule that exceeds 110% of the published FMR. Why would a PHA want to use an exception payment standard? Using small area FMRs as exceptions can be useful when the metropolitan FMR allows for HCV families to have a meaningful choice of units within the majority of the PHA's jurisdiction. But the PHA wishes to increase payment standards within specific areas. The higher payment standards will allow for access to a broader range of communities by more closely mirroring the local rental market. A PHA that is not required to adopt small area FMRs and does not wish to opt in to the use of small area FMRs may choose to adopt payment standards based on the small area FMRs as an exception payment standard in one or more zip codes. PHAs must notify HUD by email when adopting small area FMR exception payment standards, but HUD approval is not required. HUD's two-year tool includes information to assist a PHA in determining the scope of potential change opting into small area FMRs, such as the percent of their program that falls into a small area FMR, and within that population, the percent of the families that are in an area where the small area FMR is larger than the fair market rent. Users can use the payment standard tool to determine effects on family rent burden and PHA per unit cost to determine if opting into small area FMRs is programmatically wise. The per unit cost rent burden analysis allows a PHA to examine the per unit cost and rent burden trends. The tab has a chart showing 3-month rolling averages, the month-to-month change, and a graph showing a per unit cost trend line, as well as a chart showing rent burden over time. As the user scrolls to the right, a small area FMR summary is displayed along with a button for Open Small Area FMR Detail Analysis at the top right-hand side. This will open a separate workbook with the detailed analysis. A table with more detailed information of fair market rent and small area FMR comparisons and HCV family data is opened for the user to analyze and use as a resource for potential policy updates. Your HUD field office can provide assistance with any questions. All units assisted under the HCV program must meet rent reasonableness standards set by the PHA. That is, the PHA must determine whether the rent to the owner is a reasonable rent in comparison to rent for other comparable unassisted units. The use of small area FMRs does not change this requirement. Small area FMRs are designed to increase the housing options for voucher households across a metro area. As PHAs see lease-up requests for units in higher-cost areas, they may find themselves needing additional data on comparable rents. PHAs considering implementation of small area FMRs must consider the financial implications of such a decision. There may be some additional administrative costs to PHAs that are associated with changing software, systems, and staff training to accommodate small area FMRs. Additional administrative costs will likely vary depending on if a PHA fully opts in or uses small area FMRs as an exception payment standard. For PHAs adopting the exception standard in specific high-cost zip codes, the additional administrative costs are likely negligible. Implementing small area FMRs and changing the payment standard may affect the rent paid by the tenant and the subsidy paid by the PHA. More specifically, this change may be realized in a family's rent burden and the PHA's per unit cost. PHAs can use HUD's payment standard tool and 2-year tool to analyze the impacts of these changes on their program. In some cases, small area FMRs may only vary by a few dollars among several zip codes. In these instances, it may make sense to group several zip codes into one payment standard area for the sake of streamlining. For example, it may be practical to group zip codes with small area FMRs that are within $5 to $10 of each other into a smaller number of payment standard areas. This may help make small area FMRs more manageable and easier to comprehend for both staff and voucher-assisted families while still taking advantage of the benefits of higher payment standards in higher cost areas. Adopting payment standards based on small area FMRs will impact programmatic per unit cost. For PHAs that have both lower cost and high cost zip codes in their jurisdiction, declines in HAP payments in lower cost zip codes may or may not offset increases in HAP payments in high cost zip code areas. Higher payment standards are likely to increase per unit cost while decreasing rent burden on families. As previously mentioned, HUD's payment standard tool and 2-year tool can help a PHA analyze the effects of payment standard changes on per unit cost and rent burden and, more broadly, on a PHA's leasing and spending decisions. As we've discussed, for designated PHAs and opt-in PHAs, the implementation of small area FMRs may result in a reduction in the payment standard in some zip codes. PHAs must set a policy on how to handle payment standard decreases for families under a HAP contract. The PHA's options for handling PHA standard decreases are: Option 1. Hold harmless. Use the payment standard that was in effect prior to the decrease as long as the HAP contract for the unit remains in effect. Option 2. Gradual reduction. Reduce the payment standard amount to a level between 1. The payment standard that was in effect prior to the decrease, and 2. The normally applicable payment standard amount that is within the basic range for the small area FMR. Or finally, Option 3. No change in policy. Use the lower payment standard at the second re-examination. If the PHA chooses not to implement the hold harmless policy option, there are still standard regulatory provisions in place regarding payment standard decreases. The PHA may not apply an initial reduction in a payment standard until the family's second regular recertification following the effective date of the decrease in the payment standard amount. The PHA must also provide the program participant with at least 12 months written notice of the reduction. When selecting a policy for addressing decreases in payment standards, the PHA should consider impacts on rent burden, likely availability of units in other areas, impacts on the PHA's budget, implications for the complexity of implementation. If the PHA chooses not to implement the hold harmless policy option, there are still standard regulatory provisions in place regarding payment standard decreases. The PHA may not apply an initial reduction in a payment standard until the effective date of a program participant's second regular recertification following the effective date of the decrease in the payment standard amount. The PHA must also provide the program participant with at least 12 months written notice of the reduction. Standard voucher portability rules apply when a PHA is operating under small area FMRs. Families who port their voucher from one PHA to another PHA in a different jurisdiction will be administered according to the policies of the receiving PHA. If the receiving PHA is operating under small area FMRs, then the family's voucher will be administered using small area FMRs. If the receiving PHA has not adopted small area FMRs, then the family's voucher will not be administered using small area FMRs, even if the initial PHA used small area FMRs. If a PHA has insufficient funding to support portability moves and has provided notice to their local HUD office, the PHA may approve the move, but indicate to the family that their payment standard must not exceed the payment standard in effect within the PHA's jurisdiction. This concludes the presentation on HUD's small area fair market rents. Please check out the full series of webinars to learn more about the basics of the Housing Choice Voucher Program.